Hey deserving listeners, it's time for me to react to your comments from my videos from last week. Let's get to it. Darcy and Stacy video. Philippine says, I'm starting to think that Stacy only wanted a baby with Florian so that he wouldn't leave her. Yeah, there's some evidence of that. I mean, that was one of the reasons for sure, and one of the reasons why she's sad that it looks like she might not be able to have kids. But we don't know if that's the only motivation. But it's been my contention, just from the data from the show, which of course, I'm wearing my total speculation shirt, which you can buy, link below. Anyway, that for Stacy, we don't see a lot of evidence that she is in connection with her own needs, that she seems to be very outward focused, which is a result of usually emotional and attunement neglect when you're young. Anyway, so the question, does Stacy really want to have children or does she not, might actually be a hard one for her to answer. Who knows? Karina says, I think there's two separate things going on with Florian here. Yes, so this is when Florian was having trouble listening to Stacy. Yes, he clearly has an issue with Stacy's anxieties, but I think he genuinely believes that God is in control. I think at this point he is exasperated that she doesn't believe him and she refuses to hear him. Yeah, absolutely. And maybe I'm not emphasizing that enough. And they don't really go into much detail with Florian, but there's strong evidence that he comes from a belief system that God is in control completely, particularly of having children, and that it's useless to, worry about things. And two, it might even be anti-God or anti-faith to try to use medicine or try to predict how God will decide regarding children. I don't know. Certainly that could be the case, but I don't think that negates one's ability to understand the emotional landscape of your wife, to listen and to just hear her. Ellie says, I actually think the story of how he was supposed to die as a child explains everything about his reaction to these things. Yeah, absolutely. It could absolutely be a factor, if not the main factor. And thank you for reminding me about that, Ellie. Britt says, I totally agree that most people, myself included, don't really know how to listen, how to just listen sometimes. I remember trying to talk to an ex-boyfriend about things that bothered me sometimes, and he'd always get frustrated and say something like, well, I don't know what I can do about that. I never asked him to try to solve anything. He could never just listen and let me vent. Yeah, most people are not very good listeners, which is unfortunate. And I blame it on our culture, and maybe it's around the world, but it just gets passed down from generation to generation, this inability to listen. Now, some families are very good at listening, some people are very good at listening, but it is definitely rare. And I hope y'all can take time to listen, but also engineer your relationships. I know a lot of you have partners that might struggle with this sort of thing. And so just tell them, when you're not in a fight, just be like, so I just want to talk about, this isn't an accusation, but I just want to talk about our relationship and how, what my needs are. And I have a lot of needs to be heard and to be understood and validated. And when I vent and I just have something on my mind, sometimes I feel like you want to solve the problem, which I get. Thank you for trying to solve my problems. That's very nice of you. You're doing that because you love me. But honestly, what I'm looking for is just a shoulder to cry on, or a sounding board, or someone just to hear me, someone just to be with me, someone just to witness what I'm going through. And honestly, I think it would be a lot less effort on your part if you just sat back and heard me and understood, or, just you get where I'm coming from, sort of thing. And I'd like to have that part, that relationship. Rinse and repeat that a number of times nicely, because again, people are trying to solve our problems, one, out of anxiety, which they can't do anything about necessarily in the moment, and two, they're trying to help us. They're just misguided. So you just have to mold the relationship, put their loving energy in a direction that actually is received well. And remember that your partners literally might have never seen someone do that kind of listening. As a therapist, as a professor, I train people on how to listen, and it is complicated. Like, it sounds easier than it is to just listen. And when I work with trainees, and it's almost universal that when I'm working with people, novice therapists, I will say to them, remember to listen. And they will, it sounds so, I don't know, fundamental or elementary or simple, but you would think novice therapists, with all their training and all their reminders and their professional listeners, you would think that they would be good at listening, but they're usually not, because of all this, I don't know, just programming that we have around how we're supposed to respond to things. You see an element of it kind of in reaction to 90 Day Fiancé. When people watch it and they comment, they will inevitably, not inevitably, but a lot of people will take sides, right? And a lot of people will judge. And instead of just saying, I wonder where that person's coming from. I wonder why Florian is like that. I wonder what's going on there. And that's more of a listening stance, a more curious stance, a more non-judgmental stance, a stance that assumes you don't necessarily know everything, which of course makes sense, which is very foreign to people, at least in my culture. Corey and Evelyn, anonymous patron from Seattle, emailed in, went to a website, clicked on the contact button, emailed in, said, "Thank you so much for the video with Corey, who has a needle phobia. My daughter has a phobia of needles, and it's hard to explain to people why I can't just make her do it. I used to get frustrated with her, but then realized that she is just as frustrated and disappointed in herself. The moment when needle approaches her arm, some survival mechanism kicks in and she will fight for her life. We're not giving up. We're working on it, but it takes time with my daughter." Yeah, absolutely. So phobias are, prevalent, and trauma-related phobias are prevalent. And it just drives me bonkers that people, even including therapists sometimes and medical professionals, will just say, like, well, just get over it. It'll be fine. Just, don't you realize it? Phobias are irrational. That's why it's included in the DSM-5, is because it is not something that you have control over. In the same way that one doesn't have control over their bipolar. People don't have control over their phobias, and just telling them to get over it or convince themselves that everything is fine is I hope people understand that that's not rational. Anyway, so phobias are intense, and the way we approach it sometimes makes it worse, because we just push people into the deep end, and so remember that it's a treatment protocol that works is gradual exposure, and I've explained that before. But you just take, one step at a time, gradually. At the end of the road is actually getting an injection, but you start with certain lower grade anxious stimuli anxiety-provoking stimuli that will cause enough anxiety, but you prolong that over time, the body gets used to it, and then you go up the ladder, a little bit of anxiety, prolonging meaning like a half an hour plus, where your anxiety is at a 4 out of 10, and you hold it there, and if you're afraid of needles, you're watching, or your beginning steps sometimes is just thinking about needles. So you're just laying in bed or on a couch and thinking about needles, just visualizing them in your mind, and your heart rate goes up, your hands start to sweat, and you hold it there. You just keep thinking, and you're just like, you do relaxation exercises, and you probably want to get a professional to do this with you, people who are practiced in prolonged exposure. It's kind of a specialty. It's not hard to do. Understanding phobias and traumas and how dissociation and PTSD and how everything kind of comes together is pretty technically difficult for people. But anyway, and this, of course, can work for spiders or for heights or for a fear of elevators or claustrophobia, or fear of certain kind of foods, fear of the outsides, agoraphobia, fear of throwing up in public, fear of, there's all sorts of phobias. Fear of, OCD is in this category. Fear of germs, fear of having to go to the bathroom when I'm just trying to think of all the phobias that I've treated over the years. Those are some of the common ones. Fear of dating, due to trauma. So there's a cure, and I can use myself as a example that I've had a lot of the fears I've mentioned. I have a fair amount of anxiety and have treated myself with gradual prolonged exposure, and have gotten rid of all of my phobias. I mean, they're still kind of there. Needles still, like, just talking about needles makes my hands sweat a little bit, but I've had, as I said in the video, so many needles in me lately, with all the vaccines. I've had 2 COVID vaccines, 2 shingles vaccines, and a flu vaccine. So I've gotten over it, but for the most part, but my hands are, so I still, claustrophobia still a little bit, but I'm much better now. My dogs are barking. Let's get back to the, Kyoko says, Corey and Evelyn. Kyoko says, I studied abroad in Ecuador. So this is when Corey arrives in Ecuador and is on the bus, and Evelyn's like, you're on your own. I studied abroad in Ecuador, and you can for sure get robbed in the bus if you're not careful. A lot of my friends got their phones or wallets stolen when they carried their backpacks on their backs, or if they left them on the ground. Ecuador is a beautiful country with such a diverse culture, and diverse cultures, and a beautiful people and beautiful nature. So hopefully people see more than the crimes caused by socioeconomic problems. Well said, Kyoko. Mei Ling says, I am from Ecuador and can confirm that the things he's afraid of do happen, unfortunately. Evelyn placed him in a very dangerous situation. Interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Hannah says, this video prompted me to make my first ever comment on YouTube. Well, Hannah, welcome to the comment section. I know how you feel. I'm not very commenter oriented, and so when you actually make that first comment, you're like, oh. I was Corey for much of my 20s, accepting this kind of behavior, like from Evelyn, from avoidant partners, and feeling constant levels of anxiety, which I mistook for butterflies. After years of therapy, I was able to finally feel attraction for those without avoidant issues, and now seeing this makes me cringe so hard. Poor guy, my heart goes out to Corey. Yeah, it's interesting to think about, what's going on with Evelyn. Is it avoidance? Maybe. I don't know. It's just hard to read her because she doesn't wear her heart on her sleeve. There's only been a couple instances where there's... anyway, so I'm still trying to gather a hypothesis about her, and I might not ever have a solid one. Destiny says, Dr. Honnett, can you talk about anxious ambivalent attachment style? All I hear about is avoidant and preoccupied. Yeah, this is a problem to some extent in my field, that we have multiple terms for the same thing, even within the same theory. And there are various reasons for this. Attachment theory has been around for 50, 60 years, and the terminology has been written about by thousands of authors around the world. And it also is looking at different age groups. So you will have different labels for 2-year-olds, which are different labels than you might have for like a 35-year-old. And early on in my professor career, I was getting so tired of all the different terms that I just, whenever I lecture, I say, these are the 4 terms I'm going to use. Here are the synonyms, but I'm only going to use these 4 because it will be confusing if I use other kinds of terms. And so the terms that I've landed on are secure, preoccupied, avoidant, and disorganized. The reason why I've decided on those 4 is because to me they encapsulate the concept best, not entirely. But the other words that we have in the literature that are synonyms, pure synonyms for these other words are, so secure is pretty much always just secure, but preoccupied, we have anxious or anxious ambivalent. So you're asking about anxious ambivalent, which and you're like, what's anxious ambivalent? All I hear about is avoidant and preoccupied. Well, anxious ambivalent is preoccupied. So, and that's, sometimes it's called anxious ambivalent, sometimes it's called anxious, sometimes it's called preoccupied. There's other names for it too. The idea goes is that when you're young, you have attunement disruptions in such a way that as a child, you learn to be hypervigilant about attachments and to amp up your attachment reactivity to garner some attunement from other people. It's never enough because the other people aren't giving you enough attunement. But if you amp up your reactivity, meaning that this is neurologically, it's not a conscious thing, that as life is happening to you and you feel hurt or abandoned or distance, you feel your feelings 10 times as big, and then you react 10 times as big to alert other people to pay attention to you because you have your needs. And then you translate that neurological reality into an adult, and you're confused as to why everyone keeps saying you're so dramatic or you're too emotional or you're too clingy or something. But it was all developed neurologically when you were 2 years old. And so Preoccupied encapsulates that pretty well to me, that these people are almost always thinking about their attachments. Did that person text me back? Are they cheating on me? Do they really love me? These kinds of questions are a preoccupation for people with preoccupied attachment. The synonyms anxious attachment or anxious ambivalent kind of encapsulate it, but when I get into other terms, you'll understand why I tried to get rid of the word anxious. Then we have avoidant, which I've talked about. And the main synonym for avoidant is dismissive, which is also a pretty good word. And I think avoidant and dismissive pretty much, I could choose either one, but I think avoidant. But another synonym for avoidant is anxious avoidant. So we have that word anxious again, which I think can trip people up. And I've experienced this with students. They're like, anxious avoidant, anxious, is that anxious? You know, because you have anxious ambivalent, and then a different one, you have anxious avoidant. So, and then you have fearful, which is, I'll get into later, which is like fearful, anxious, you know. So preoccupied avoidant, we do away with the word anxiety, because really all of the insecure attachments are scared. So do we call that anxious? Do we call that fearful? Let's just get rid of, they're all afraid. And so, now, the reason why we call it avoidant and or dismissive, the reason why I landed on avoidant in my nomenclature is because when people are young and they're being consistently, not attuned to, the child learns neurologically and somewhat consciously that I need to turn away from attachments because they're not going to meet my needs. So as a strategy of not being harmed by others, I just need to ignore others. Even though I'm desperately wanting attachment with others because I'm not getting my needs met, I'm just going to shut this down neurologically and behaviorally. And so these people, children and adults, will avoid relationships. When there's attachment worries, they will run. They will say, I'm out. I don't need this stuff. I don't need people. I'm okay on my own. Now, underneath it all, they're incredibly desperate for attachment and will exhibit behaviors that will counter what they're exhibiting on the outside. And so avoidant seems to fit. Dismissive is pretty close to. Anxious avoidant is pretty good too, because it acknowledges that although they are avoidant, they are anxious on the inside. You know, I will often say that underneath every avoidant person's veil is a preoccupied person. Underneath every narcissistic person is a borderline person. And so the anxious avoidant label, I think, encapsulates that a little bit, but it still kind of throws this anxious word in there, which I think can confuse people. So that's why I just stick to avoidant. The fourth is disorganized, so you have fearful, disorganized, or fearful avoidant. And I just decided to do disorganized because fearful doesn't encapsulate it. Certainly fear is a huge element of disorganized. So for disorganized people, they were often abused by their attachment figures in a very terroristic way, meaning that the child was simultaneously at the age of 1 or 2 made to feel afraid by their parent, by their caregiver, and desperate for connection with their caregiver. So they're caught between a very, very rough rock and a hard place that they want to run away, because children, and really any human of any age, runs from fear and runs towards safety, right? It's a basic human or animal instinct. And children are no different, but we're attachment creatures, so our safe places typically are parents. So on a normal day, you're out on a walk with your 2-year-old and there's a dog barking and your child runs to your side. Okay, so they go to your secure base. They run away from the dog, they go to you. But what happens when the terror is coming from the parent? So the parent is both the antagonist and the savior. The child is stuck. So the child's like, so they don't know what to do. They desperately want to run away from their parent, but they also desperately want to run toward the parent. And so these children have no coping because they don't know. So remember, the avoidant and the preoccupied people, they developed a coping style. The preoccupied people said, I have to be hypervigilant, I have to lean in. And the avoidant people said, I have to lean out. So at least the avoidant and preoccupied people have some strategy. Disorganized people have no strategy. It's just, they're frozen in fear. They're very frequently in a state of fear, particularly as they get close to people. As they get close to people, because they're so, you know, you're 35 years old, you're in therapy, you're in a romantic relationship, you're desperate for closeness. You might have never had secure attachment, so you're desperately seeking that. And then as you get closer, you have this transference, this displacement of the fear from your past onto the current attachment figure, and you feel desperate, intense fear as you get close to someone. And there's no way to cope because the preoccupied person will just lean in and try to cling. The avoidant person will be like, oh, this is too intense, I'm out. The disorganized person just goes, you know, it's like a deer in headlights feeling that disorganized people feel all the time. And so that's why I like disorganized, because there's no organization to the coping. It doesn't fully describe what the experience is like, because it's not like the person feels disorganized. It's not like they necessarily look disorganized. What they look as often is fearful, and that's why it's often called fearful. Fearful avoidant is another term. I'm not going to go down that road, but anyway, so that's why I stick with preoccupied, avoidant, disorganized, and secure, and that's why I avoid these other kinds of labels like anxious, ambivalent. I hope that makes sense to people. Hoop says, I think Evelyn is insecure, so she creates distance and puts Corey down so she can maintain power and control. She's terrified of being vulnerable. Yeah, Hoop, good old Hoop. It is a viable hypothesis that for Evelyn, she is terrified. She is starting to have, well, anyway, I'll develop an hypothesis. I don't have very firm hypotheses yet, but we'll keep an eye on it. Kenny and Armando finally got around to watching Kenny and Armando. A lot of you have been asking that I watch them for a while now. Anastasia says, I cry almost every single time Kenny and Armando are on the show. Sometimes sad, sometimes happy tears. They are my absolute favorite couple of the 90-Day Universe. Yeah, agreed. I probably cry every time too. My wife cries every time they're on the screen. There's just so much, I think what it is they're so good, the two of them, particularly Kenny and his family, at expressing their sadness through tears instead of through anger and aggression, which a lot of people on the show do. And so it's just natural as a human to empathize with people. They're also very likable, so it's easy to identify and to have compassion and have empathy for them. But I think a big part of it is a lot of their pain stems from societal oppression and bigotry and hatred and brainwashing to the masses that gay people are wrong. And it feels like such a tragedy. This is why movies that have LGBTQ people at the center and the oppression they're experiencing is a theme of the story. It really just cuts to the heart of what's wrong with so many parts of our society. I mean, these people are so innocent. They just are who they are, and yet society just decides that they're going to make their lives miserable, to the point where a lot of people take their own lives because of being made to feel that they're worthless or something. And so I think, at least for me, when Kenny and Armando's tears and the family's tears, Armando's, anyway, I think I feel it's like it's like a true story of good and evil, where you have the evil of bigotry and the good of Kenny and Armando. And it's real, it's happening. And it just, you see their pain and their frustration, and you feel it with them. And so I think it's natural to cry for a variety of reasons with them. And to just lament our societies, just to cry about the pain we all feel, regardless of whether we're a part of an oppressed group or a particular oppressed group or not, that the sadness of it and the pain of it and the tragedy of it is, I think something worthy of a lot of tears. Inner Peace says, I grew up in a very Christian family that often preached against same-sex relationships as sin, etc. In high school, I became best friends with someone, and she came out to me as lesbian. I had the same experience as you. Within a second, I just realized how stupid everything I had been taught was. Anyway, many of my family members still to this day are anti-LGBTQ agenda, which, like you said, is just wanting equality. I had a conversation with an aunt one time about it, and she finally said, it scares me. And I wanted to point out that's homophobia. But I did not want to label her and for her to become defensive, so I just explored that fear with her. I hope maybe I planted a seed, but I doubt she will ever give up on her beliefs. Yeah, good for you, Inner Peace, for trying to plant a seed and not being a mean jerk face to your aunt. I mean, she's been brainwashed, and you're not going to unbrainwash someone by yelling at them or putting them down usually. Good old Stella Annie says, it's so frustrating that I can't really cry anymore, exactly for the reason you described. In my mid-20s, I taught myself to never cry, and now it's extremely difficult. I didn't know that about you, Stella Annie. I'm sad to hear that you can't cry. It's something that a lot of people will train themselves out of because of shame and fear. And there's a way back. So keep going down the road, Stella. You'll get there, I'm guessing. Try to feel when there's things that you think are provoking sadness that might provoke tears. Focus on your sadness and what it feels like in your body and the implications of the fear. And maybe that will help. At the very least, that will help to validate your own feelings to yourself. The other thing I'll say is that crying isn't necessary to get your needs. People don't have to cry, but you do have to feel your feelings. And so some people, when they feel their sadness, they just don't cry, but they deeply are sad and hurt or whatever their feeling is there. So don't be too attached to crying necessarily, but I suspect that if you keep going down the road, you'll get there. Daniel and Mohammed. Annie says, Danielle always had this vibe for me, like she thought she owned Mohammed. Yeah, it's interesting. It's a fair observation, Annie. Why would Danielle feel ownership over Mohammed? That's, I think, the question. And what type of ownership? On one hand, you could say it's racism, or she's a psychopath and she just doesn't care about other people's feelings. I think more likely, given what we've seen, is she has this very childish version of love. When, for those of you who have kids, or maybe even for yourselves, when a 10-year-old or maybe even a 5-year-old, maybe 15, anyway, children, when they have a crush on someone and they haven't really developed true empathy or the ability to really mentalize what's going on in someone else's mind and to understand that their impulses aren't necessarily fair, that sometimes people's crushes as children will manifest as ownership. Because when you have a crush on someone, when you love someone, you want to own them. It's just like, I just want all of you. I want you around me. I want you you're just a object. You're not really a human being. I need you, And you'll see children do this. They'll be like, okay, you're mine now. Or it might even with friends, actually. Let's get away from romantic relationships. You'll see a 5-year-old say, this is my friend now, and you are going to do what I tell you to do. Instead of, I really want you to be my friend. Do you want me to be your friend? There's not a lot of questioning when you're a child because you just don't have that ability to really understand what's going on in other people's minds. And I think that Danielle suffers from that developmental issue. I don't know. There's not a lot of evidence that she has a strong ability to know what's in someone else's mind. She also exhibits, a fair amount of childishness, which I'm not saying as an insult. I'm saying as evidence that something is going on with her psychology. I'll just put it that way. I don't know what that would be, but it's the way she treats Muhammad in this way of possession fits in the general constellation of things that I've seen from her that is childish and unaware and lacks mentalization. Anyway, Faith says, my mom used the same tactic of triangulation on me with my dad. So I was talking about triangulation where Danielle was triangulating her kids. My mom used the same tactic of triangulation on me with my dad, and it was extremely distressing. It caused me to feel like I had to be obedient and agree with my mom about everything, no questions asked. Yeah, I'm sorry you went through that, Faith. That's terrible. Too Cute says, maybe Dr. Honda can explain why so many of these people lie so readily about major issues, virginity, relationship status, finances, careers, criminal history, etc., and then fall apart when the person who was lied to gets angry and threatens to leave. Why did the liars think? What did the liars think would happen? Is it emotional immaturity? Is it low IQ? Is it narcissism? Are they psycho? It's not fair at all to the other person. If I was signing up to buy a refrigerator, I would be pretty angry if I found out after I got home that it didn't come with shelves or refrigerants. Well, Too Cute, you have a good analogy game going, and as you know, for me, I like a good analogy, and I often have weird analogies, and I love your analogy. Yeah, if you're signing up, this isn't something I would say. I could just see myself. If you're going to buy a refrigerator and the refrigerator comes and you open it up and there's no shelves and no refrigerants, you're going to be like, how come this happened? When I bought it at the store, like you kind of left that out. And with a lot of people on the show, Danielle included, they will pull people into a relationship. Muhammad comes to the States. He says, oh, by the way, I don't have any money. I'm in a debt and all these kinds of things. And so why do people lie? Well, so you have some questions of, specific conceptualizations. Let's just address narcissism. There's a good possibility that y'all don't understand what narcissism is. It's being thrown around on the internet a lot, and I've talked about it before. So whenever you're thinking, ooh, it's narcissism, question yourself on what you mean by narcissism. I suspect what you're meaning by narcissistic in this moment as a possible label for liars is selfishness. Just call it selfishness. And it's not a character trait. Selfishness is something people resort to. Narcissistic personality disorder is extremely complex, and listen to my deep dives for patrons only, by the way. But I talk about it in other, free episodes. It's a lot more complicated, and almost like completely different concept than is what being discussed on the internet. So, if I was to look at Danielle and other people on the show that have lied, who else have lied? A lot. None are coming to mind. But anyway, there's a lot of people who will say, well, I have this big secret, but I'm going to wait till they're here, or I'm going to wait till I'm over there, and then I'll tell them. I seem to remember Rebecca did that with Zied, that kind of, anyway. So why don't they tell them up front? Well, I think it's obvious, and I think a lot of us do stuff like this, that they're worried of rejection. They don't want to be dumped. They are wanting to get their needs met, which involves attachments, and they, I think, rightly equate telling them about this shameful thing that they will lose their attachment, and then they're not going to be able to get their needs met. It's really that simple. But most people who have who aren't being a jerk face will not do that to someone. They will tell them as soon as possible so that it doesn't ruin the other person's lives. Give the other person enough information to make a decision, which might mean telling them before you see them in person. I think there's some gray zone there. Like when Rebecca didn't tell Zied about her same-sex relationship in the past, she waited until they were in person. One could debate whether or not she should have told him that, prior to when she went to Tunisia. Or you could say, well, that's kind of a conversation you have in person. It doesn't really, it shouldn't really matter to Zied. And it ultimately, didn't sway him from marrying her. Anyway, point is that there could be some gray zone, but why would Danielle do it? Well, we have to look at Danielle's. So we have the reason, which I stated, but why would one not be able to figure out, well, I don't think that's fair to the other person. What's there? And this is where people say, oh, it's narcissism. It's like, well, what do you mean by that? Are you just saying they're self-centered? They don't care about it? I think on the internet, there's two words that people should be using that they're not using on the internet when they're saying narcissistic. One is selfishness, which is fine. It's a non-clinical word, and it is selfish to lie by omission for self-gain. The other word is lack of empathy, and which is also semi-clinical. It's not a DSM label, but and it's very specific. So you could say, in that instance, that person lacked empathy. What people on the internet will do is like they'll look at those behaviors and they'll try to paint the entire person with a word and say, well, that person's narcissistic. When we all are selfish, sometimes we all will lie to get our needs met. At times, at least in our lifetime, no one, hasn't ever done it anyway. So there's so when you look at Danielle, it's like, well, it's selfish to do that. Yeah. And it's also lack of empathy. It's also a lack of understanding where Muhammad would be, how he would need to hear that before he comes to the States, and how he would be hurt by that. You're letting your needs override your better thinking. What's the word? Your better judgment. And so now with Danielle, so you're saying, is it narcissistic? I don't know if that, and then you also say psycho. I don't know what that means. Are you saying like, I don't know what that word means. I know how people use it, but I don't know how it's used in this context. Then you say low IQ. Yeah, certainly. I don't know if low IQ is necessarily associated with this. I will say inability to make decisions well, which might be associated with IQ, absolutely can play a role. And Danielle exhibits this a lot, that she doesn't seem to be able to logic her way out of situations, and becomes real locked in, I think, based on her undifferentiated emotions. She's just like, this has just got to happen. Anyway, you say emotional maturity. Is that the problem? Yeah, that's a label you could use. But too cute. You're talking about like people in general, maybe on the show, maybe in your life, that have done this. And it's what I would say the best analysis or concept that would probably apply to many situations is lack of decision-making ability, denial. We see with Summit, he seems to be in denial of what the situation is, because he probably had to develop a strong ability to go into denial to deal with his mom when he was a child. I don't know, but he seems to just be like living in the moment and denial of the bigger picture. And so that's another reason why people might quote unquote lie. It's just like, I just don't want to do it right now. You could just see someone in Danielle's position going like, well, if I tell him about my finances, he's going to break up with me. And we all understand how desperate Danielle is for Muhammad's love. And so you could see her, I just don't want to think, I'll deal with that later. I'll deal with that later. I'll deal with that later. And then when, the crap hits the fan, then you have to tell someone, then of course you've dug yourself in the hole. Now they distrust you on all sorts of, levels. So it's also difficulty regulating your emotions, difficulty getting your needs. If Danielle had other attachment, security, secure attachment with other people, she might have been able to like, well, you know, if things don't work out with Muhammad, at least I have these 5 people I can depend on. I don't think Daniel has that. So I think there's a lot of reasons, and, you know, the list goes on as to why people would lie in a situation like this. And I don't think we need just like a word to describe a very almost universal human behavior. Devin and Jihoon. So I don't usually read the entire username, but this one's great. Made a YouTube account just to comment on 90 Day Fiancé videos. That's their account name. I think this whole psychology thing is just a side hustle for Dr. Honda. His primary occupation is bidet expertise. Along those lines, I've converted my wife into a bidet person. I don't know how excited she is about me revealing that. And I just spent a couple days ago installing a couple bidets in our house. And so now we got bidets everywhere. Joseph says, bummer, I see what you did there. Yeah. Featherbrain says, YouTube just showed me an ad for a bidet, LOL. But guess what? We already have one. $30 from Amazon. As a Pakistani Muslim, the first thing I did in the US was install a bidet. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know what it is about the US. I mean, I have my guess. Anything having to do with the privates is like so disgusting or taboo that people just don't even want to think about it. And I'm sure I've said this before, but when I tell Americans, white Americans, because, you know, the Asians are a little bit more, ready to do it, even though I'm 4th generation. And of course, I'm guessing that Japan didn't have bidets 150 years ago when my ancestors used to live in Japan. But it just, when I, as a Japanese American, when I go to Japan and I see all these bidets, as a Japanese American, I'm just like, well, maybe I should be adopting that. I'm more open to it, I guess. Anyway, point is that when I talk to people who aren't, and I don't want to say all white Americans, but a lot of white Americans, and I've been talking about bidets for decades. I mean, 20 years ago, it was, a lot of people didn't even know what it was. I mean, now there's more ads, and anyway. So when I would talk to them, I'd just be like, so, you know, if you got some crap on your elbow, would you just run it, or would you just wipe it off? You know, would you just take a piece of cloth and wipe it off? They'd be like, no, I'd wash that stuff with soap and water. I'd be like, well, how come down there you just let it go? And they'd be like, well, what do you mean? Like, I get it clean. I get it clean. You know, this weird mentality kicks in of just like, well, I don't know about you, but I'm pretty clean. It's almost like insulting that one would have to clean down there or something. Like, I'm saying that they're disgusting when I'm just like, you know, that's normal, right? It's okay that you need a bidet. Anyway, and or people would just be like, gross, how come you're tired? Anyway, so I think things are changing, and, you know, at least changing in my house. Good old Lean Donut says, bidet tragedy, which is what I call the episode, bidet tragedy would be a great band name. Oh, you commenters are just cracking me up. Seriously. Bidet tragedy. What kind of music would it be, though? I mean, obviously metal could be, but it also could be like an ironic, like a band like the Beths or something, where it's just sort of like poppy guitar rock. Bidet tragedy. So, you know, ironic band name. Bidet tragedy. I could also see like a funk band, a really good, you know, down to earth funk band. Anyway. Gab Mag says, there isn't a day that goes by that I don't watch Psychology in Seattle. Ah, thanks. And I don't know why, but today, listening to Dr. Honda say, take care of yourself because you deserve it, you really, really do, that made me cry. He doesn't know me, but he really makes me feel seen. So crazy how that works. Well, that's nice to hear. And I get it. On one hand, so how do I put this? I do feel like I know you. Obviously not all of you, but I feel like, I don't know. What is it? why do I feel a connection with you whenever I'm doing these kinds of things? I think it's because I wouldn't be able to do it otherwise. And I've been podcasting for 13 plus years, and so I've interacted with a lot of you. And so I just feel this connection. I really do. You know, like when I'm saying things like take care of yourself, and from the beginning, I mean it. I think it's also, you know, being a therapist, it really builds this muscle of understanding what's happening, understanding that people are suffering without them having to tell me. I don't know. I remember maybe midway through my career, I turned this corner when I was like, oh my God, it's like, you know, not to be grandiose about it, but it's like Neo in the Matrix, where I suddenly saw all the suffering that was happening. I was like, oh, suffering isn't the exception, it's the rule. Like, everyone is suffering. And I don't know why, and maybe it's a fantasy of mine, but when I talk to you right now, I can see you there. And some of y'all will send me pictures on Instagram or something, or you'll tag me on Instagram of you watching. So I kind of have this vision of like where you're at. You know, you're on your couch, or you're on your bed with your cat, and you have a TV at the foot of your bed, or you're on your laptop, or, you know, I've seen you've sent me the pictures, and it actually, it's kind of nice because it gives me this like vision of where people are, which helps me to feel, you know, as I've said before, the reason why I do this thing is because I want to make a positive difference in the world. It's not because I just want to, you know, clicks and view numbers and stuff. I actually, from the beginning, you know, the first number of years I did the podcast, hardly anyone was listening, but I still did it because some people were, and some people were positively affected by what I was talking about. And so, or at least they said so. And so that kept me going, you know. And so when I can visualize y'all, it helps me to, and when y'all will say that it's helpful, and when you say you cry because you're really taking it to heart, when I say to you, take care of yourself because you deserve it, you really, really do. I'm not just saying that as a thing. Like, I mean it. I mean it to myself. I mean it to you. And when I say that I feel your suffering, I know you're suffering. I know you're scared. I know you're hurt. I know you're lonely. I know you're maybe even in physical pain. I know you're, I don't know, uncertain, or all the things. You know, I know that because I've seen it so much in my work, and I've paid attention to it so much that even though you're watching this on YouTube, I do feel like I can feel it, and I do feel like I can see you, and that means a lot to me. And we've been, you know, doing these comments episodes. I think it furthers that back and forth as best as I can engineer it, and that is I think the purpose of my life. is that. And so it doesn't surprise me. The other thing I'll say is that when I listen to podcasts that I listen to, or YouTube channels that I watch, you know, I feel seen sometimes by them as well. What was I? Oh, John Green, who you might know him from Vlogbrothers, from the history. What was that? Anyway, he's a writer, and he has this podcast called Anthropocene Reviewed. And there are episodes where he doesn't know me, but I feel seen by John Green. I mean, the things he said, I'm just like, how do you know me so well? And we'll cry. So I think it is, you know, good to obviously feel that, and to maybe even seek it. We live in a internet world a lot of the times, and I think it's okay to accept connection, even when it feels like it's weird to feel a connection. We should invite connection, and we should not be ashamed of it, and we shouldn't shy away from it, and we shouldn't feel like there's something wrong with us for feeling a connection like that. in a lonely, suffering world, we need all the help we can get, right? And as I always say, take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.